a special edition of Raising the Conversation, a podcast from the MacRae Centre for Faith and Culture at Acadia Divinity College. In this mini-season, host Joel Murphy and guests dive into the topic of strained presence, as explored in our Navigating the Future report.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am very excited about our guest today. Dr. Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme is, I would say, probably one of the leading sociologists in the world, specifically within the religion space. We were just talking about her upcoming trip to Europe, where she's presenting. She works at the University of Waterloo and does research in the space of changing religious landscapes, secularization trends, generational shifts in Canada, US, and in Europe. She's a strong quantitative methods and a keen eye on social implications, and her work is influential. And I know I've leaned on it in my own readings and insight and learning. And I'm really glad that you're able to join us and share a little bit of your insights, Sarah.
Oh, well, thanks, Joel. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the lovely introduction. Thanks for having me.
Yes, I think it's a privilege. And so I feel like we could talk about a number of things, and I could just listen to your insights around, but have a few questions, and then we'll see where it goes. But I want to start with an article that you wrote in 2024 with Jose Pereira Cotulo. I think, did I say that right? Or close? And you reference several very, I think, interesting, relevant topics to the current report that we're putting out, which is around this concept of strained presence. And I was wondering if you could speak to the term fuzzy fidelity and what this means and how you see this particularly relevant to in consideration of today's religious climate. And I know that's a lot of words, and so feel free to make it much more.
I'll make it my own. No, great question. So this concept of fuzzy fidelity, it was first coined by British researcher David Voas in probably somewhere around the 2000s. I think he published in the late 2000s on the topic for the first time. And it often refers to the large number of people who have some ties to a religious group or tradition, but are not necessarily regularly involved or active with a faith group or with a church or a mosque or a gurdwara, for example. And so these individuals, they'll self-identify with the tradition. Maybe they'll occasionally do some activities related to that religion, often around holidays or, key rites of passage like baptisms or marriage or funerals. But they're not like in regular contact with the faith group. So they've got some fidelity, but it's a bit fuzzy, right? That's the idea of the term. And this is actually quite a large group in most Western societies. So here in Canada, according to StatsCan's 2022 General Social Survey, which is a big survey they run each year, there's an estimated 45% of the Canadian adult population who could fall into that category of fuzzy fidelity. So who are affiliated with a religion, but don't necessarily attend all that regularly religious services, so attend less than once a month, let's say. So that's kind of usually who we're referring to when we say fuzzy fidelity. I've also seen the term used for people who are kind of more spiritual but not religious, right? So the fuzziness is the kind of less conventional spirituality side of things. So they're not necessarily part of a more organized religious group, but they are, they hold certain beliefs, certain practices that are still tied to the transcendent, to the supernatural, but are maybe less conventional, not kind of part of more what we call like the traditional big world religions. And that population in Canada, that kind of SBNR, spiritual but not religious group, depending on how you measure it, there's a lot of different ways of measuring it. It's usually about a third to a quarter of the Canadian population. So somewhere, between like 25 and 33% of the Canadian adult population, depending on if you measure it, if you're people who self-identify as spiritual, that's usually a bigger group, versus people who are actually doing spiritual activities, that's just like a smaller group in Canada. And so David Voas sees fuzzy fidelity as like a stepping stone in religious decline, right? That's how he wrote about it and how he understands it, as kind of a part of the process of intergenerational religious decline, right? So, in Canada, many Christian boomers moved away from regular religious attendance when they became young adults in the 60s and 70s. So they went from being kind of more actively religious as kids with their parents to being more kind of fuzzy fidelity folks in their adult years. And that's something that happened around, especially the mid 20th century and onwards. But what David Voas and others like myself notice is that that fuzzy fidelity is quite hard to pass on to the next generation. So, boomers were quite often in church with their parents from the silent generation. And so they got a pretty strong religious socialization, what we call like a religious education, right? They were in contact quite frequently with their faith group, even if they decide to move away from it a bit as adults. But their kids, the boomers' kids, so Gen X, millennials, and now Gen Z, so their kids and grandkids, they didn't have that regular contact because, their boomer parents were less involved with the religious group, right? At the time that their kids and grandkids were being raised. And so it's kind of hard to pass on that kind of like vague, like, well, we identify as Catholic or Christian, we'll go for Christmas or for Easter. And, for boomers, that kind of made sense because it's still got ties to their upbringing. But with Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z, for a lot of them, it's like, well, we've never really had that many ties with the religious group. So why would we say we were Christian? Why would we bother going at all? And so what we see with, not everyone amongst younger generations, but with a larger chunk of younger generations today, more of them break all ties with religion. So they'll just say they have no religion and not even have that kind of fuzzy form of fidelity. So that's kind of like a kind of intergenerational process of decline that Voas maps out and that we can see to a certain extent here in Canada. But just before we move on, one thing that's important to note is other authors, like someone like Sarah Johnson, in her new book, it's called Occasional Religious Practice, Valuing a Very Ordinary Religious Experience, kind of understands fuzzy fidelity, or what she refers to as occasional practice within Christianity. She understands it a bit differently, right? It's kind of the same phenomenon, but she highlights the fact that occasional practice is the dominant way in which people relate to Christianity in Canada today, right? A majority of Christians, usually, depending on which age group you're looking at and which tradition you're looking at, are having this occasional practice rather than a more frequent, regular, active practice. And that's the case not only in Canada, but in lots of different Western societies. And so, to understand the roles of religion in contemporary societies and to do liturgical theology that connects with experiences of Christian worship today, Sarah Johnson argues that it's really crucial for both academics like ourselves as well as religious leaders to take occasional religious practice seriously and to take it as, to recognize that it has value in its own right. It's not just like a problem that needs to be solved, like we need to get people more active, but it's like, no, this is actually a very common way of relating to Christianity that has kind of always been around. We've just never really had the tools to measure it in the general population before, say, the mid 20th century. But as soon as we did have those tools with like survey or public opinion data, when we asked people how often they were attending religious services, we actually saw that, actually, this is quite common in the population. Right?
Oh, that's interesting. I have a question that we didn't talk about. Can I?
That's okay. Yeah. Throw it in.
I there's a lot of I would say there's a lot of buzz around what people are describing as a renewal, particularly within the Gen Z.
Okay.
Like I think coming out of the UK, this idea of a quiet revolution where
Right.
young people are coming back. Like, what are your?
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts about that? Because it's coming up again and again and again, and I know.
Yeah.
A certain level of excitement, particularly from like church leaders or Christian leaders. But I'd be curious about your take on it.
Yeah, I don't want to be like the party pooper who kills all the excitement on this. I'm not as convinced I would call that a revival. So just for folks who are less familiar with it, what's happening is that amongst the youngest adult age groups, so say like your 18 to 24-year-olds who are now Gen Z, that we typically call Gen Z, we're starting to see a bit higher numbers of religious practice amongst them. And I mean a little tiny bit. They're still really low. There's still 2/3 of them who are not attending religious services at all, ever. But they're a bit more than what you see amongst millennials, so the next age group up, so like your 25 to 45-year-olds. You're seeing that in the UK and the US. You're also seeing that a bit here in Canada. Now, we've seen that with every prior generation before they leave their parents' home, right? So kids, young adults, look like their parents while they're still living with them. And if you think of that practically, it's because their parents are bringing them to church with them. And so their practice looks more. I have a theory, and this is just an educated guess at this point, more research needed, is that with Gen Z, they look more like their grandparents because their grandparents now have fewer grandkids. So they have more time and resources for each grandkid. They're also more involved in many cases with childcare because both parents are working and childcare is expensive. So grandma and grandpa get to do the childcare in a lot of cases. And so grandma and grandpa are taking more Gen Z to church with them. And so the Gen Z numbers, while they're still living at home, their original parental household, look more like their parents, maybe even their grandparents. And so the big question is, once those Gen Z move out, right? Once they go and establish their own household, maybe they go off to university or college, maybe they get a job and they form their own household. They become geographically mobile. They also meet new people in what is in Canada a more secular context, often, not always, depending where you are. And that's a big moment that we've seen in previous generations, like with millennials, like Gen X, that we've seen a big round of disaffiliation amongst the generations. So they're no longer attending with their parents. They're just like, whatever. And they don't continue it once they move out. The big question is, will we see that with Gen Z as well, right? I'm always, I'm not saying we have to see that. It's been a trend we've seen with previous generations. Doesn't mean we'll see it now, but I'm going to wait for like the next 5 to 10 years. It's always the boring answer from a statistician. It's like, I want more data. I'm going to wait for the next 5, 10 years to be able to confirm, to see, do we see that wave of disaffiliation and drop in religious practice that we've seen with millennials and Gen X once Gen Z leaves the parental household, because a lot of them are still living with their mom and dad and their parents now? Or do we not? Maybe the trend, they buck the trend and they keep those slightly higher levels of practice. I am, again, emphasizing slightly higher levels of practice. Any new young people at a faith group, I understand, is exciting, and it is exciting. Religious leaders should be excited. But as someone who looks at general population trends, it's not going to like change the whole nature of our society overnight either. Like slightly higher percentage, like we're talking like within 5%, usually less, higher rates of regular religious practice amongst this group. So interesting times, but some people have really, really taken the stats to heart and are hoping for a big revival. I'm kind of a bit more kind of pragmatic maybe in saying it's an interesting trend, not different from what we've seen before, but let's wait and see where it goes. Yeah.
Thank you. And that's actually really interesting and quite compelling to me. That speaking about that, the boomer, like that's my mother-in-law looks after our kids, so I can appreciate that. Is returning to the article that we were previously discussing, this idea of, in the same article you talked about how, and I think it's connected to this conversation about the Gen Z as well, like social life is more complex. Like in your research and thinking, when you think about this complexity, how is it shaping and influencing the way that people are approaching, adopting, and even living out their religious beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, this is, if the answers were easy, we'd all have them by now, and we don't necessarily, right? I mean, religion and spirituality, sometimes people almost think of them as like these separate phenomena from everything else that's going on, that march to the beat of their own drum. And that's really not the case, right? And that is the nature of my field of sociology of religion, is we're really interested by, one, how religion and spirituality impact society, so all the other aspects, right? Education, health, how we interact with others, but also how society impacts religion and spirituality, because it really does. We really see a shift. When we see shifts in the rest of society and in ways of doing that people adopt, we also see those shifts usually within religion and spirituality as well, right? Let's take one example. Since the 1960s, let's stick with the boomers, since the mid-20th century, we've really seen this turn towards what we call expressive individualism. So, someone like Charles Taylor or other scholars as well really use that term expressive individualism to refer to the fact that we've moved away from valuing external authorities like religious leaders, like sacred texts that used to be kind of like, okay, oh my God, we've got a question. Who do we go to? We go to like a religious leader or a sacred text. we don't value that as much now in our societies. We value much more kind of individual decision making, authentic personal experiences, autonomy, individual autonomy. We put a lot more value on the individual and what they think and what they decide and what they want to experience. And we call that expressive individualism. And that's really a specific way of doing that has emerged in kind of the mid 20th century in most Western societies, including here in Canada. It came about with a variety of changes, especially the growth of our consumer market economy that really wanted to emphasize personal experiences to like sell you stuff, basically.
Right.
And you know, we take this for granted now, but it was a big change back then. Like we don't even think about it anymore. But other changes like the Canadian government taking over more provision of social services to become a bigger welfare state, you know, in health and education, and kind of emphasizing, you know, doing so that kind of giving every individual the chance to flourish and to be, you know, with equal circumstance. That's the goal, at least. We haven't really achieved that yet, but we're trying. And so these kind of big societal shifts kind of also impacted our kind of core values. And so now if you interview parents and say, hey, what kind of values are you trying to pass on to your kids? Not many will say like, oh, I want them to respect, you know, this church leader or this religious institution. They'll say much more like, oh, well, I want my kid to, you know, have enough information and be well informed that they can make their own decisions about who they want to be and what they want to do. You know, parents like secretly hope that like they'll manage to pass on their faith as well to their kids, but they're like, no, but it'll be their decision. We'll just try and give them the tools to be able to make those decisions, right? So that's much more putting the emphasis on that value of expressive individualism. And like another way of seeing it is like in public opinion surveys, like human rights have almost like a universal level of support in Canada and in a lot of Western societies. And human rights are really a concept that come out of that time of kind of like, you know, it's the individual that holds rights and that should be protected, right? And so, you know, and this wider societal shift of expressive individualism really has a huge impact on religion and spirituality in many ways, right? So a large number of people use those values to justify why they've left religion or not involved with religion. It's like, well, it's not really for me. Or, you know, my values aren't reflected in those of this religious tradition, for example. And again, it may or may not actually be the case factually in reality, but it's the perception. A lot of the time, it's the perception of what it is. My joke is like people's personal, authentic experiences, in quotation marks, often look a lot like each other because they've all learned the same kind of authentic experience from each other. So there's still an impact of society here, but it's what we value and how we perceive things. And so it's those values are often used. If you ask non-religious people, why are you not religious? It's like, well, you know, I believe in individual freedom. I believe, right? And it's these values that are brought up that are used to justify not being part of a religion. They're also used to justify why some people are spiritual but not religious, right? People kind of are seeking out these kind of authentic, personal, spiritual experiences and might not necessarily find them with a more traditional religious group, so might look elsewhere, New Age, online, spiritual communities, yoga, or various other areas. But even amongst those who are religious, who are more actively involved in a faith group, you also see changes, right? There's a bigger emphasis now. I think Sam Reimer at Crandall University, New Brunswick, calls it the inward turn, right? Where people are much more focused on that kind of individual spiritual experience with God, rather than on like community and tradition, right? Community and tradition are still important, but they're like maybe not like the first and foremost thing that people are thinking of. Funnily enough, like religions become more like evangelical Christianity in that way. Like the emphasis is more on like the personal experience in some ways, right? Compared to like say Catholicism that puts a lot more emphasis on community and tradition. And so you see this within most religious groups, even ones that were more, you know, originally focused on community and tradition, the focus is much more now on that kind of individual experience. And so that's a big societal shift that's happened all over the place, including within religion, right?
I think that's really, the expressive individualism is such it changes things, right? Because it's in referencing like Sam Reimer or the other work, right? It's this shift from what's informing, like it's not just a collective, like you said, communal emphasis of like, this is where we're going. It's an individual, which therefore makes it like a fragmented, like it's post-modernity, right? This fragmentation piece. And then that makes inherent more complexity, I suppose.
And it has real implications about how people do religion, right? People will, maybe go to a service during the week, and maybe then they'll go online and look up some things that interest them in their own kind of personal journey, right? I mean, this is kind of a very common way of doing religion spirituality now, right?
Yeah. Which is like, I think it leads me then into this, like our final question. And I really appreciate the insights around this because it's refreshing because your approach is a lot of the people we speak to are probably coming from a primary like theological perspective. And I know you can hold the tension there, but your perspective and your engagement and bringing the sociological perspective, I think is really helpful because it just helps us able to understand more what's happening around us, right? To be able to then consider and navigate that. So as you think about religious leaders, how would you encourage them to engage with these changes? How would you like? Everybody's going to respond differently, I suppose.
Yeah.
But like, what and maybe in your experience, what have been some of the best responses or most the ways that people are able to navigate? Because it could be a tension for a lot of people, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? What do you do with the information, right? My goal is always just to provide the information, right? I mean, because there's a lot of narratives out there about what's going on. I'm interested in what's really going on, what's actually happening. And so I'll go and get empirical data, in my case, in the form of statistics and public opinion survey data. But also I work with others who do like, in-depth interviews with people, or like, might go through like content of what religious groups are putting out on their social media or online, or what people are posting. And the idea is to kind of gather that information and get a sense of, what does the landscape look like? It's obviously complex, like we talked about earlier, but what are some of the key trends that are going on, and where are we seeing? And what people do with that information is I kind of leave that up to them, right? It's not really for me to say. It's not my role as a sociologist to say, well, this is a good way of doing it, this is a bad way of doing it. It's just to kind of hopefully get that good quality factual information out there. That's hard enough to do on its own. So I don't do more, especially in a day and age of misinformation. It's even worse. But I do always kind of just want religious leaders to make informed decisions, right? So to actually have a good sense of what's going on with their own faith group and with others in their community and in the country or in the region they're in. And so, I have no strong opinions. It's up to them. I have seen various approaches. I've definitely seen some faith leaders who have decided to kind of say like, okay, well, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing because it's always worked for me. And, that can work. That can work for, a certain group of people want to, keep to traditions, want to keep things as is. And that's very important to them. It's very meaningful for them. Certain rituals have always been practiced by their community. And so, that can be approach that works. I mean, and then other faith leaders are going to try some kind of new or innovative approaches that are kind of maybe more in line with shifts amongst, say, younger adults, and to see what works. Sometimes they're just kind of like throwing things out to see what sticks to the wall, and with mixed results. Sometimes it lands, and there's some new young people who are interested, and they manage to reach out to them and to bring them in. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it actually backfires, and people feel it's really weird and they're not sure what's going on. And so, I think what I like to say if we're talking to religious leaders and to community leaders is I don't think the expectation of a wide-scale revival is realistic in our current social context. I know a lot of faith leaders are hoping for this revival. We just talked about, people jumping immediately at a small shift in statistics, hoping it's a revival. But in a society where we have a lot of what we call secular competition, so that's other ways of doing, other things to do, other ways of thinking, different worldviews that are not related to a supernatural or transcendent element that we typically define as religious. We're probably not going to see everyone just jump on board one thing, right? We're no longer in that same society that maybe we were more in the earlier 19th century in Canada, where, the church was the hub of political, community, social life in the village, in an agricultural life world where there wasn't much else going on. And there was a lot of social pressure to be part of that church and to be part of Christianity, to be Christian, to be quote unquote a good Canadian. That is no longer there, right? It's not coming back anytime soon. And so that's not the context we're in. So don't expect, a vast majority of the population to suddenly come back when those conditions aren't there. That being said, that doesn't mean, people have to give up or that there's no opportunities. It's in some faith leaders I've spoken to, they almost find that freeing. It's like, oh, good, we don't have to please the majority anymore. We can do what we want. We can try new things. We can go for those who are really actively involved and who faith is really meaningful for them. And we can try these new innovative measures, which maybe in an age where they had to kind of represent everyone, they couldn't in the same way, right? So in some ways, some people see this as an opportunity. Active religiosity is not a majority phenomenon anymore in Canada, but it is an important minority phenomenon. It's a substantive minority. It's about a core of the population in Canada who's attending religious services at least once a month. And so maybe, working with that group and looking to maybe some others who might be interested to kind of see what new ways you can do faith and do religion and do spirituality, right?
I completely agree. And I think like the thing that I really appreciate about all those statements actually, and putting like the theological seminary hat on, I think it just helps people who are interested in or faith leaders to grow in wisdom, to grow in awareness. I think that is a helpful response. How do we look around us, understand what's happening, and then respond? And the response is then informed by your traditions, your values, your beliefs, all those pieces,
and your own experiences and situation too, right?
Yeah. I think that's awesome and a really helpful framing for this point in time that we're in. I think that just recognizing the complexity of it.
I mean, I think it's cool. Like, I'm fascinated by all of this. I'm just anyone who wants to talk about it. I love talking about it because I love studying it. But yeah, we're definitely not in the same social context that we were, say, 100 years ago, right? And once people kind of accept that and see that, then it's like, oh, okay, where do we go from here, right?
And as a futurist, like that's the language, like that's like being able to understand,
who knows,
right? And then being able to be like, and then let's imagine.
Let's imagine.
You can hopeful. You can look to what a possible preferred future could be, but then also then recognize. We'll see what happens.
I mean, we'll see. I mean, this is it. Like for me, there has to be more fundamental structural shift in how we do society for there to be a shift in how we do religion, right? And so if there is a big revival, some of those kind of core conditions I talked about, like secular competition, less social pressure, they'd probably have to change. And that change doesn't usually happen overnight, but it does eventually happen, right? The social change does happen. We just don't know when, and we don't know what it's going to look like, what the next version looks like. It could look like completely different from anything we can imagine. It could be something that brings people back to religion. It could be something that brings people to a new religion, or it could be something that forces people or gets people to move away even more from religion, right? And so we'll wait and see. I'm someone who works in trends, and so I'm always like predicting and talking about probabilities that we're likely to see this trend to continue, but at some point the trend changes, right? So, and that's exciting. I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime, but we'll see.
Well, I really appreciate this, and we'll connect. We'll put a citation for the article that I was referencing and the book that you mentioned, and really appreciate your willingness to share your insights and your perspective, and give us something to add a layer and a layer to the complexity, but a really robust, I think, perspective around what's happening. So thank you.
Well, thank you. It was really interesting. I love talking about this stuff. So it was thanks for having me on.